They've stood vigil for centuries, colossal stone sentinels silently staring out over the Pacific, their backs turned to the sea as if protecting the island from an enemy within. The Easter Island Moai have long been a mystery, their purpose and origin shrouded in enigma. But thanks to new scientific breakthroughs, the code has finally begun to crack. And what they uncover isn't merely interesting, it's profoundly disturbing. These ancient statues were never merely symbols. They were cautionary signs, chiseled into volcanic stone and left behind like warnings from a civilization that knew something was to be, or perhaps already was, on its way. For centuries, the Moai were seen as little more than cultural oddities, giant stone faces veiled in legend, bringing visitors to their knees in awe and scholars to their keyboards in speculation. But as new digs unearthed what lay beneath, the story grew darker, stranger, and far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. If this kind of story touches your heart, if you're someone who cares about truth, responsibility, and speaking up for the voiceless, please like this video, subscribe to our channel Spark Science, and share it with someone who should hear it. Let's get started. For over a century, the Moai statues of Easter Island were cast as mute witnesses to a cultural collapse, impressive relics of a lost civilization but little more than oversized stone heads planted in the earth. That's how it was imagined, at least, until archaeologists, in the early 2010s, began to unearth something incredible, that nearly all of the Moai actually have complete bodies hidden under the surface, some extending as much as 30 feet underground. The world was shocked, transforming the statues from symbols of mystique into giant underground mysteries. But if that news was enough to spark public imagination, it was only the tip of the iceberg. Over the past 5 years, a new generation of digs uncovered a much darker, much stranger level of history below the surface, one that left even experienced archaeologists reeling. In 2023, a multinational group of researchers and scientists again traveled to Rapa Nui with more sophisticated equipment and a provocative new hypothesis, that the Moai were not just monuments, but shrouds. Concentrating their efforts on the eastern slopes of the Reno Raraka quarry, the researchers found a series of underground chambers cut into volcanic rock beneath some of the biggest statues. These weren't random natural formations. They had unmistakable evidence of intentional construction, basalt tunnel supports, ordered stone steps leading into the unknown, and roughly reinforced walls. Certain chambers seemed to be ceremonial in design, with obsidian figurines formed into circles, burnt remains of wooden buildings, and steep, narrow shafts which led deeper underground. The most startling feature of all was that there was no written account nor oral tradition which could describe these buildings. It was as if the entire layer of the island's history had been deliberately suppressed or purposely buried. Soil samples taken at these sites in the chambers told an even more sinister tale. Chemical testing indicated abnormally high concentrations of phosphates and heavy metals found in decomposing organic matter, namely, human remains. Broken bones, such as ribs, femurs, and jawbones, were found just beneath the foundations of several Moai, burned and strewn about. Most had blunt force trauma. Some had slash wounds. Others seemed to have been exposed to fierce heat, perhaps by cremation or ceremonial fire. But the manner in which they were placed pointed to something more than regular burial. These weren't graves, they were disposals. There were no tombstones, no indications of respect. If anything, the proof pointed toward brutality. Death, here, was utilitarian. Intentional. Perhaps sacrificial. One find particularly heightened the stakes even more. Under the Moai, Ahu Te'er, the crew found a human jawbone that was half fused to volcanic rock. Geologic testing showed that the rock had been heat-treated after the jaw was positioned there, hinting that a hot fire had been deliberately lit at this particular spot. The suggestion was horrific, either the jaw had been seared into the stone in some ritual, or it had become wedged there in some cataclysmic event. Either way, it wasn't an accident. Someone desired that jaw and whoever it was belonged to, trapped, forever. Even more disturbing, perhaps, were the acoustic irregularities captured in these subterranean spaces. As they mapped out one of the lower tunnels under a cluster of statues along the island's western ridge, scientists detected something unusual, a steady, low-pitched hum that increased in intensity as they descended deeper. It was not mechanical and was not recognizable as any natural resonance within the geology that surrounded them. Audio engineers who were consulted to look into it characterized it as subsonic but structured, a frequency which could be felt rather than heard. It throbbed in the chest, in the bones. One of the researchers compared the experience to standing before a sleeping engine, or something alive. These same chambers also had a peculiar absence of natural echo, as if sound was being sucked into the walls. Whether or not these were purposeful design features or an acoustic coincidence in nature is unknown. But either theory touches on knowledge and purpose far more complex than was formerly attributed to the early island dwellers. Going further towards a solution to the mystery, ground-penetrating radar scans in early 2024 uncovered enormous lava tubes and networked tunnel systems under the island beneath established Moai sites. Some of these systems line up directly under clusters of statues that are grouped in bizarre geometric configurations. A number of the tunnels are obviously altered, enlarged, or reinforced with stone and lead to what appear to be man-made chambers, many still uncharted. Why bury the Moai, if they were strictly ceremonial, so deeply over tunnel systems that had no apparent function on the surface? One explanation now in vogue is that the statues were not memorials, but seals, dense stone sentinels strategically positioned to top, watch over, or envelop the buildings below. Dr. Lena Morrow, a geologist who was part of the latest expedition, said being in one of these rooms was disorienting in a way I can't explain. She added, "It wasn't just quiet, it felt like sound didn't belong there. You could hear your own heart beating like it was ringing inside your head. And beneath the central column, there was this hum, this vibration, that nobody could track. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It just existed." What began as a curiosity about old stone statues has now turned into something more of an archaeological horror tale. As each layer was unfurled, it seems the Moai were not only remnants of cultural pride or religious worship. They were utilitarian. Constructed with a purpose. Oriented with something more profound. And maybe constructed not to commemorate the dead, but to protect the living from what was hidden beneath their feet. But who were the inhabitants that constructed these gargantuan guardians, and what in the world were they attempting to suppress? Long before scientists came along with drones, scanners, and soil probes, the Rapa Nui had an answer to the Moai, and it wasn't a peaceful one. Handed down from generation to generation in oral form, the island's greatest legends tell of a fierce conflict between two castes, the long ears and the short ears. At first glance, it reads like simple mythology, the kind of symbolic tale you'd expect from any ancient culture. But recent archaeological evidence suggests it may have been much more than metaphor. According to the legend, the long ears were the ruling elite, taller, more powerful, and ruthless. They are said to have enslaved the short ears, forcing them to build the Moai and maintain the ceremonial platforms. Resentment mounted over time. Finally, rebellion broke out. The short ears revolted, and there was a vicious civil war that concluded with the virtually complete genocide of the long ears. The final battle allegedly occurred by a trench full of smoldering reeds, into which the long ears were goaded and slaughtered. Throughout the centuries, this tale was accepted as allegorical, a warning regarding power and tyranny. But when archaeologists started digging at sites near Poik Peninsula, where the rebellion was supposed to have happened, they discovered something impossible to overlook. Under the hardened earth were layers of charred earth, charcoal, and human remains, burned in precisely the manner described in the legend. Some of the bones were stuck together in unnatural positions, packed tightly as if the bodies had been dumped or shoved into flame. Radiocarbon dating fixed the mass burning in the period that oral legend had indicated. More significantly, DNA examination of remains at multiple sites indicated two genetic populations, one physically taller on average, with thicker bone structures and indicators of more protein intake, perhaps the elite long ears. This was no metaphor. The war actually occurred. And the Moai. Some Rapa Nui elders said that they were not merely symbols of status or ancestors. They were said to be filled with mana, some sort of spiritual energy or force that was capable of both protecting and destroying. The biggest among them were said to have been awakened, as if alive, able to walk, migrate across the island through the combination of ritual, prayer, and song. That sounds like fantasy until contemporary researchers were able to recreate so-called walking, using ropes wrapped around the statues and rhythmically rocking them in a forward motion, demonstrating it was not just possible but doable. But the most chilling fact from the myths may be what the Moai were supposed to observe. In some versions of the myth, the statues were deliberately placed to face inward, their backs to the sea. That has long puzzled archaeologists. Why turn your ancestors away from the vast ocean, the very source of Polynesian identity and sustenance? One version of the answer, preserved in whispers among the Rapa Nui's oral historians, is simple and terrifying: the Moai were watching something inside the island. Something that should never be allowed to escape. And here lies the most unsettling truth of all: maybe the Moai were not built to commemorate the past but to guard the present from a deeper past that still stirs beneath Rapa Nui's volcanic rock. The legends, the bones, the tunnels, the hum, all of it suggests that these were not statues of pride or honor. They were locks, constructed to keep in something so dreaded that a whole civilization dedicated its power, its blood, and ultimately its very existence to keeping it imprisoned. The deeper that modern science burrows, the more the distinction between myth and reality collapses. And the question becomes irksome: what exactly were the Moai sealing in place on Easter Island, and what happens if those seals fail?